I kind of describe it as time off the roller coaster. So we're on autopilot a lot and we go from day to day doing what we're doing. And it can be really, really hard to take time out and to pause and stop.
In today's video, I'll be talking with Linda O'Hara, a longtime teacher and more recently, a life coach. As work often gets draining for many of us, we explored various ways of coping and the different actions you can take when work becomes too much. We're going to talk about the topic of work. Actually, this is how we met, because you used to be my English teacher, and I just remember loving your classes, and it was really just a fun time of like a group of 6 girls getting together and drinking tea and then reading Shakespeare. And it sounds like a very like made up thing that this would not really happen in high school, but it's really like it was.
The most amusing thing about your description just then is, yes, we definitely always had tea, but we had no boys, even though it was a mixed school.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it wasn't an all-girls school.
Yeah. But it sounds like it from the description. For some reason that year, the advanced course didn't attract boys.
Kicking it off with the topic of work, the first question to start with would be, looking back at your career, being a teacher, now going into life coaching, what has your relationship with work been like, and how has it evolved over time?
It's been very positive. Actually, I think one of the things that I like about us talking about work is that for me, it's definitely not a bad word. And I'm very conscious of how many people come to me with frustrations around work, or even just in casual conversation, how's work going? And you can nearly anticipate a groan, a sigh. So I've been very, very lucky, Beata. I suppose I've also made smart choices. I remember being very young. I'm the eldest of 5. And I remember playing like on old records. So we're going back now into the 1980s. I remember playing songs on my parents' record player and getting my younger brothers and sisters to sing along. And I don't even know if I had started school. I probably had. I must have been 6 or 7 perhaps. But I think there was an early sense of, this is a job that I see somebody else doing and I want to do it too. So there's a sense in which it's always been there, even as an older sibling. I think I was teaching in my own little way. So it's very positive. My relationship with work has always been very positive.
Was there any moment when you found work draining, where it was really challenging for you?
Sometimes when I'm challenged by the students' lack of interest, I shift my focus to them as a person and find what makes them tick and hope that transfers into the subject. And it doesn't always work, but you have to step back. You're not in complete control. Teachers teach, students learn, and it's very important to be accepting of what happens at their side of the journey.
How do you deal with that on a more of a personal basis when work is kind of challenging and frustrating, and you know that there is nothing that you can actually solve there? How do you deal with that when you maybe come back home?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And I think actually my answer is linked to the previous answer. If you're investing in both, if you're investing in the content and in the human relationship, it's extremely unlikely that you won't find a positive. So I think counting the blessings, which is a total cliche, but counting the wins rather than dwelling on the frustrations is the way to cope. And I think if you're investing widely enough, you'll find something.
And I also love the idea of counting the wins and focusing more on the way where you can make an impact and when you're doing well, more than actually where things are not going that great too. It gives an overall impression of success at the end of the day.
100%. Yeah, there's always something working well and functioning. Always. It can take time to find it, but there is always something. And looking is the important thing. And investing widely means your chances of finding it are greater.
For some people, it might be that the work or the job they're currently in is very draining for them, is very difficult. What are the different ways that a person could cope with a situation that they might not necessarily have the chance to escape? Yeah, they're looking for different ways of managing what they have to do.
I've already worked with a couple of people who present that exact thing where work is draining. And the really interesting thing about narrowing the focus is that in a lot of cases, people found themselves in that work or job because they sought it out. So there's the really interesting, I found myself where I want to be, and now I find it draining or energizing. So the first thing I think that's really important is to check actually if the work is the problem. Because in one particular case where I worked with somebody recently, it was one person at work that was the problem. So there was a really draining interaction that was happening every single day. The actual work wasn't the concern at all, but there was interference with getting on with the work. And initially when the person came to me, the problem was work, full stop. The person and their work is absolutely perfect. But the pressure of this daily contact with somebody, it's like a breathing down your neck sort of situation. That became synonymous with work as a problem. And in actual fact, the person and the task was fine. The person and the colleague. And it was really interesting because the person, it wasn't a boss or a manager or anything. It was more a case of somebody that they had to collaborate with who insisted on telling them all the time what she was doing. It was really impacting on the girl's work. But in actual fact, her relationship with her work was fine. She needed to manage this interaction that was happening every day at work.
Do you know how that situation got solved in the end?
Yeah, well, interesting. That as we worked through it, this was in the context of a coaching relationship. As we worked through it, what the person realized they needed to do was either limit the interaction. That was the first goal, like, because it was so clear that the interaction was creating all the wrong feelings. So limiting the interaction was the first thing. And then because it was quite amusing, you can't necessarily create that distance if you have to collaborate with somebody. So the person's successful strategy in the end was, I need to measure the damage and put measures in place to balance out the damage. So for example, they had kind of strategies like, I'm going to have scheduled walks. So they almost had their phone beeping like, oh, that's where I'm going to get in 1,000 steps. So they needed to limit the time. They couldn't really limit the amount of interactions, but they could limit how long they lasted, and they could do something afterwards to try and take them out of it. Because they said to a certain extent, the problem was the person would move away from the desk and they would sit there frustrated by what had just happened. So instead of sitting there frustrated by what had just happened, they got some fresh air, for example. So it was a kind of a threefold thing. Hard to manage the total amount of interactions, relatively easy to keep them shorter, and very, very easy to do something to minimize the damage.
I suppose it also comes down to self-awareness and realizing what is important for you, what you need, or what you have struggles with. And I think this brings us nicely to our workshop.
Yeah.
Would you like to give a quick introduction of the workshop, of what it is actually about, and what could people expect there?
Yeah. So really what the workshop is I kind of describe it as time off the roller coaster. So we're on autopilot a lot and we go from day to day doing what we're doing. And it can be really, really hard to take time out and to pause and stop.
So this is an exercise that everyone can do for themselves. Even right now, if you're watching the video and you need more time, you can pause the screen and kind of think about this.
The important thing is to think about what it is you're doing, how enthusiastically you're doing it, and what the return on that investment is.
In your view, what does it mean to be engaged, and what does it mean to be energized, and where is the difference?
What it means to be engaged, we'll take that one first. What it means to be engaged is when, it doesn't have to be all day, every day, but when there is a sense in which you can actually get lost in what you're doing. So when you're going in the morning, you're conscious of what's ahead and you're looking forward to it. There isn't that dread. And while it's important to have a healthy relationship with work and avoid, for example, something like burnout, the sense of enthusiasm for going back to a task or starting a task for me is really crucial to the engagement. And I think depending on the workplace or the organization, engaged is also about perhaps the team and the community. So of course you can be a solo traveler on the work road, you can be self-employed and building your own business. But if you're working in a community environment, I think your sense of what's happening on the periphery outside you is really important to engagement. So the general sense of how you're getting on with the task you're doing and how the world around you, the peripheral space, is functioning is for me what engagement is about.
Mm-hmm.
And the energizing then, I think, is it really comes back to the person and their well-being. So if you're thriving, for me, that's what it is to be highly energized. So all of the basics, like sleeping well, eating well, and having the time to eat well. You know, too much eating on the run might be a sign that you're not highly energized, because in some way you haven't got that under control. You know, you're catching up And it's very hard to be highly energized when you're catching up. So signs of highly energized are things are happening the way they should be happening. Good night's sleep, well-planned meals, the basics of well-being away from the workplace, they're happening where a person is highly energized. So if for example, I take my own, I would consider myself very, very engaged at work. So I'm very, very close to 3 o'clock. I feel very lucky as a teacher that our breaks come regularly. We work Monday to Friday. So I always have Saturday and Sunday to re-energize. Of course, we bring work home, but you manage your time differently with what you do at home. And we get the half-term breaks, you know, the week at November, the week in February. So I would say it's easy for me to be highly engaged because I use the breaks that I get very, very well. So my engagement is close to 3 o'clock. Because I use the breaks wisely, it's really, really energizing. So I don't see a weekend as an opportunity to catch up on the week or to get ready for the next week. If I did, I would never stop. So it would be much lower in energy. So the really important thing is that you find yourself 2 X's, and depending on where they are, you fall into one of the quadrants, one of the quarters. And when we go to the other screen, we'll see how which quarter you're in tells you something about what life is currently like. But I think to go back to where we started with this, the point of the exercise is, how is work? It's this or it's that. Well, it's often more complicated. You need to break it down a little bit, and what you are putting in and what is coming back can be 2 separate things.
For the moment, we can move on to how we actually interpret the results. So when you have your quadrant, then this is what it means.
This relatively crude tool would give you a first insight into, I suppose, 2 aspects of what work might look like. So it's part of what I was saying earlier about narrowing things down a little bit, breaking it down. So I have to move us in order to see the results myself. So where I put myself up in the top right, highly engaged and highly energized, I would count as somebody who is really thriving on what it is they're choosing to do every day. The person that we put in the bottom right, they may be investing massively, but it is not turning out to be very energizing. And I think depending on where you put yourself, it might give you a first insight into what you might need to change. So this is back to the narrow focus. The highly engaged person who isn't thriving, what can they offload? What can they maybe share? What can they delegate? Or like in the example of the person I was talking about who was drained by the interaction at work, what can you do to balance out the feeling of being minimally energized? Are there things that you love to do that you're not finding time to do that would help the balance here, if that makes sense?
So it doesn't even necessarily have to be always connected to the work itself, but also to what we're doing outside of
right. How you manage, I suppose the return can be to do with outside, because in that example, and there are plenty of people who are working at home, keeping the home ship steady, it can feel as though that's all there is. And sometimes the feeling more energized can be about creating a break from it or delegating it or sharing it. So the ultimate increase in energy is coming from, in some way, managing the amount that you're doing, and the fact that it's, I suppose, all consuming in a negative way is a little bit crude, but that's what's happening there in that example. I suppose the interesting one that I always find when we look at the results here, the top left one always interests me, because people can talk about not really doing a huge amount and how great they feel on that. And I find that a really fascinating one to talk about, because some people, their engagement is low because they get away with it. For example, they might be in a very lax workplace where the demands aren't high and it's easy to get away with not doing a lot. And the reason I'm always interested in that one is if the person is talking about work as a concern, are they really, really that happy with doing so little?
I've also noticed in my personal life, when work gets draining, let's say because of different things that are going on, or there's more busy period or a stressful period, it is very, very important that the activities that I do outside of the 8 hours per day are something that energize me and are something that are recharging the battery while not always at work it's possible because of different things that we just don't have control over, but the activities that we do outside are definitely very, very important as well.
Massively. It sounds easy when we're talking about it. This balance is much harder for people to get than we're making it sound, I suppose. And the thing I'm very conscious of too with people who are highly energized, and I mentioned it a few minutes ago, highly energized, working hard, burnout is something to be conscious of if you're really feeling that you're thriving and on top of it, because a real sign that somebody might one day encounter that is doing a lot and thriving on doing a lot and more and more and more, and being very conscious of where the more is coming from. So more time for me, and like you said, doing the activities outside the 8 hours, that's a healthy more and more of the work because you're loving it might be a kind of a warning more. It's great to thrive on it, but do you know where work stops? And energizing things away from work, exactly like you said, outside the 8 hours, do you know where they stop and start? So being highly energized is something to keep an eye on too, because the source of that energy is really important.
So again, it comes down to this self-awareness, that kind of keeping a check on where you are, and not always keep going and going and going, but really taking the time to stop, even if it's just for a couple of minutes every now and then, and checking in whether what you're doing is actually okay for you physically and mentally. And
100%. And going back again to the workshop is that longer pause and longer check-in. But exactly what you said there, the couple of minutes every so often is really, really helpful. Rather than staying on the roller coaster and going, little pause to check in. What am I doing and is it working for me is so important and so powerful. Hard to find the time sometimes, even if it's only a couple of minutes.
And going back to the workshop, there's much more that actually you explore there. So it's not just work, but it's also about relationships, emotions, and so on. So there's a lot more than you get from, was it an hour or two? How long is the workshop?
I think it's between the two. We're aiming for about 90 minutes, yeah. And it's all, the thing that I'm quite pleased about in relation to it is it's all very much what it is that's happening for you. So it's not presenting a solution before we look at the problem. It's inviting you to look at what it is that's going on, and we see from there where you need to go and what it is you're looking for. A lot of it is to do with what we said earlier about what is there too much of, what is there too little of, and what can you do about it.
If I could summarize everything what we spoke about, I think I would put it into 3 points that people can take away. Mm-hmm. First of all, it would be to keep this level of self-awareness and identify where is the problem actually. And even if you're not currently seeing a life coach, maybe just be that life coach for yourself and ask yourself, is the problem really this problem, or might it be something else? The second thing would be that we mentioned actually right at the beginning when you said that, focusing on the wins in your professional life, even when things might not be going that great, just focusing on the wins and on the positive. Mm-hmm. And lastly, also the importance of the time that we spend outside of work. Mm-hmm. And that might also be an energizing agent when it comes to work, when work might not be that great, mm-hmm. but we can still energize through this time that we have left and at the end of the day.
You see, bearing in mind the same person who goes to work is the same person who comes home from work. Mm-hmm. It's very easy to see them as different individuals. And I love the way you described that third point, because it captures that idea perfectly. The same person who goes to work in the morning is the one who comes home in the evening. And the awareness of that individual of themselves is what keeps it a positive path. Great.
Then for everyone who's watching, I will be including the link to Linda's website where you can learn more about her work and the workshop. So check it out in the description box below. And it was lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do the interview.
My absolute pleasure to do it. I'm conscious that we don't have a bell ringing at the end of this conversation. We're used to getting our interactions in and waiting for the school bell to ring. So it's been nice not to have that pressure this time round. Great to talk to you. Thank you for asking me.
If you guys enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Iconic for more content around psychology and personal development. See you in the next video.